folks, and thank you all so much for coming out to the Hot Docs at Home platform. My name is Will Denovi. I'm the special programs curator here at Hot Docs, and I am very excited to welcome you all to today's special live Q&A with Dr. Mike Daley, who's going to be digging into his wonderful new Curious Minds Speakers Series, Neil Young, Words and Music. Over the next half hour or so, Mike and I are going to be running through some of the wonderful questions that you have been submitting to us in response to this great new 6-part series on the life and music of the great Canadian music legend. This is a series that, of course, will be running on our Hot Docs at Home platform until the beginning of October. So if you haven't managed to watch all of the lectures yet, that's just fine. You've still got plenty of time to do so. But in the 2 or 3 weeks since we launched it, quite a few of you have made some serious headway into these lectures, and you've sent a lot of great questions on all 6 lectures. So Mike and I are going to run through some questions now that really cover the full breadth and depth of this series, and should add some opportunities for further engagement with the great material that he's been exploring in these sessions. So just to kick things off, folks, I'd like to ask you all to join me from the comfort of your homes in giving a warm welcome to one of our favorite lecturers here at Curious Minds, the one and only Dr. Mike Daley. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Will. Good morning.
It's great, always great to connect with you from your scenic home studio on Broadview Avenue in the east end of the city. We always hear a little bit of lovely background music when we check in with you. Mike, tell us what's being played today.
Well, shortly you'll hear some improvised classical music played by my wife Jill for ongoing Zoom classes for the National Ballet School, Canada's National Ballet School. And so she's been doing this every day for the past few months. Well, 5 days a week, and playing for auditions too remotely. And they've just been providing top-notch ballet instruction to students all over the world who have, who aren't in residence, who have gone back to wherever they live. And so there are nighttime classes going out to students in Asia, for example. Jill doesn't have to play for those. I'm glad of that, because it would be 11 o'clock at night. Yeah, so this has been a big part of our summer, has been, and for me, it's been a treat because I have really been able to witness what a class is like and hear the flow of a class and the way that a teacher will, sing. A teacher will say, okay, so let's do a rond de jambe from the corner, and then a jeté and a fouetté, and then Jill plays, she'll come up with something that sounds like music off the top of her head, and it's pretty cool.
Absolutely.
So it's been interesting to see that process.
Yep. Well, always good sounds emanating from the Daley household. And speaking of good sounds, it's really exciting to get to dive deep into some of these great questions that our friends in the audience have submitted in response to your wonderful Neil Young Words and Music series, the latest in a long line of great musical portraits you've done for us here at Curious Minds, from Leonard Cohen to Joni Mitchell to Bob Dylan, now here to Neil Young. I'm going to dive right in, Mike, because we've got a lot of great material to dig into this morning. And I think the first theme that I think our friends at home really wanted to hear you weigh in on was Neil's newly released album, Homegrown, which was launched in July. This is an album recorded in the 70s, finally reaching listeners today. You briefly mentioned it in your 6th and final lecture, but I think folks, they're dying to get your take. What do you make of this new addition to his discography?
Well, the impression that one gets from a Neil Young album being pulled out of its original context of when it was supposed to be released, and then hearing it now so many years later, decades later, it's tough to hear it in context. It would be, to me, like, especially since this was such a fertile period for Neil Young in the mid 70s. He records this album right after On the Beach, one of the great Neil Young albums, right before Zuma, and then he instead decides to release Tonight's the Night, the album that he had recorded back in 1973. And so he in fact was pulling something out of time, not that far out of time, but replacing this album at the time. And for me, Neil's albums have, especially at that time, they really derived a lot of their meaning from the context of where they were in relation to the album before that. Because Neil is he's such a career artist, right? He's somebody where every album, no album or no song stands on its own. It's always seen in comparison to the other material that he's done. Like, is this a throwback to Harvest? Is this one of his sort of Ditch trilogy types of albums? Like, where does it fit into our understanding of this guy's whole career? And so to hear it now, it's very hard for me to place it, and that has been exacerbated by the fact that 3 of the songs I've already heard for years. So Love is a Rose and Star of Bethlehem came out on the Decade album, which I grew up with. That 3-album set was really, that was my Neil Young album, where I really got to know his career up to that point. And so, and then the third one is Little Wing, not the Jimi Hendrix Little Wing, but Neil Young's Little Wing, which appears on the Hawks and Doves album, another album that I listened to 8,000 times, not that long after it came out. So when I listen to Homegrown now, those songs stand out for me as the 3 strongest, and some of the other things stand out to me as not that strong. There's a little bit of a tossed off quality to at least some of the songs. Some of them are lovely. And, Neil has retrospectively characterized Homegrown as being the missing link between Harvest, Comes a Time, Harvest Moon, and Old Ways. I think he said Old Ways. So he's placing it in sort of that country, that mellow country rock Neil stream. I'm not so sure that I would see it that same way. That seems a little too neat and tidy to me, and it doesn't sound to me like it's of a piece, even though there's acoustic guitars and things like that. It doesn't really have a country sound. It doesn't have the pedal steel guitars that we associate with those albums and the sort of overtly country feeling. Neil said at the time, or shortly after, that Homegrown was too personal, and I find On the Beach much more personal to me. I don't hear that again, but who am I to say? He knows how he feels about the thing. My impression of it is that I think it's a minor work overall, and I think he made the right decision in releasing Tonight's the Night instead, because Tonight's the Night is, in my opinion, a masterpiece, and it's to me, it's one of those albums that just stands as a kind of monolith of pure emotion, like John Lennon's Plastic Ono Band, would be another one. Like, just these albums that are so raw, and it's so rare to have a work of art like that. So if you would say to me, do I wish that he would have gone back and released Homegrown instead, and that Tonight's the Night would have stayed in the can? Well, I would say no. Tonight's the Night to me is a far greater work. But again, it's this view of mine is tainted by the context in which we're hearing Homegrown all these years later. And so it's very hard for me to hear it with those fresh ears. It's like if they came out with a new Beatles album between Rubber Soul and Revolver
Right.
that nobody had ever heard or heard of.
Right.
Or well, we knew about Homegrown, but you know what I mean? Like where there was this
Absolutely.
lost Beatles album that they just shelved, you know? And
Right.
how could we can't hear it
Right.
today. So in a way I can't hear Homegrown.
hmm Well, so Mike, I think you've hit on a couple of the key themes that I think a lot of the questions are we've received touch on. Firstly, this incredibly fertile period in the mid '70s, but then secondly, adjacent to that, the idea of the sort of the emotional turmoil that Neil was experiencing during this incredibly fertile period in his career. We got an interesting question from audience member Danny Gold, who referenced the New Yorker article that you and I had sent to the audience about Homegrown from their wonderful music critic Amanda Petrosic. And she had an interesting passage about the loneliness she hears in Neil's voice on Homegrown. She writes, Young's voice is one of the loneliest things in the world. On long, dark nights, his records can be brutal companions, though there's almost no one else I want to hear from when I'm attending to some fresh spiritual wound. It's a really a great evocative piece of writing there. But Danny wanted to get your thoughts on that idea of the sort of the loneliness at the heart of Neil's music. Is there something cathartic about his music and about his voice in particular?
Yeah, so his voice is, I've thought a lot about singing voices. In fact, I wrote my master's thesis on Bob Dylan's singing in the first 6 years of his recording career. And so I think that Neil Young's voice is very important to the way that we think of his music. And so what do we have here with Neil's voice? Well, we have a voice that is, in terms of pitch, is not always spot on. And there's a shaky quality. And I think that feeling that often where he seems to be up in the upper range, just straining to hold on to the note, has that in itself, just the way that pitch is delivered, like notes are delivered, tugs at the heartstrings, because there is an element of effort there and a precarity and a feeling like almost like a delicate quality, like he's barely making it, you know. That is sometimes the way that he sings. Other times he's yelling, and that's another part of his aesthetic, right? And I think also the range in which he sings is important, that he's singing up in this high tenor range, and his voice has a thin quality that makes it, to my ear, childlike. And so he has this man-child quality. He doesn't quite sound like a child, but it's some sort of hybrid, you know, the boy inside the man. And so I think there is also, that adds to the feeling of vulnerability and I think when we listen to a voice, that is, when we really listen to a voice, we allow that voice to be an avatar for our own emotional workings. And I think Neil Young's voice is really effective for a certain type of emotional state. I also think he's pretty good in the yelling mode, as well as in Rockin' in the Free World. You know, the sort of hectoring, nagging kind of approach. You know, he's really good at that too. That's a different sort of aesthetic bag or emotional bag. And I think also everything works in contrast, right? So the contrast in Neil's music is always between his voice and his guitar. And his guitar tends to be low, guttural. He tends to hammer on the bass strings. You know, if you listen to his accompaniments for himself, he's often hanging out in the low part of the guitar and hitting it pretty hard so that it buzzes. When it's an acoustic guitar, you know, so that the strings vibrate so much they're hitting the frets and you get that kind of rattle or buzz. And when it's electric guitar, well, we've talked about in the course how he favors that sort of fuzzy, grungy, sludgy, sounds like the amp is about to explode kind of sound. So you've got that, and then you've got this ethereal man-child voice on top of it. The contrast is so striking, and there's a balance there that keeps it from getting too twee or too precious, right? Because so often when people sing in that range, or in that way, in that sort of delicate way, it can get a little cloying. But it never is, at least for me with Neil, because there's always that leavening of that content with other sonic and seemingly affective or emotional content coming out of the guitar in the band.
Yeah, great study in contrasts for sure. Building, Mike, on what you're saying about his unique aesthetic, or the aesthetics plural that he's able to harness in his music. We got an interesting question from audience member David, who wrote in to say that Neil once said that he'd rather play in a garage, in a truck, or a rehearsal hall, a club, or a basement. So is it important to think of the sort of the pursuit of authenticity as one of the guiding principles of his work? The idea that something might not sound totally polished and pure, but the idea of capturing something spontaneous and real was more important than achieving some sort of perfection in his performance or his recordings.
Yeah, that's a big theme that comes up again and again with Neil, and we really see, and again, using that word aesthetic, which is kind of my preferred way of thinking about musical style, and I think of a musical aesthetic as kind of a set of unspoken rules or ideals of process, of product. Like it's, we talked a lot in the Bob Dylan course about Bob Dylan's aesthetic, which in some ways has been pretty consistent. In some ways, he has changed it over time. Neil Young also has had a pretty consistent aesthetic, at least since I'd say the early 70s. If you look at his very early work, it's very different. You see much more of a polished kind of approach. If you look at his things that he did with Jack Nitsky, immediately following the Buffalo Springfield, and in the end of the Buffalo Springfield with the orchestral things and this kind of very produced. And then he goes the other way, and he goes for minimalism quite often. At least in terms of instrumentation and texture, simplicity, and that he often looks for musical situations, especially recording situations, where he can feel that things aren't too antiseptic, that there is an authentic quality. So, recording a bunch of the tracks from Harvest in a barn, for example, is a famous example of that. So he's trying to keep things real, and whatever that means to him, right? And we see this too with his recent struggle to, this kind of struggle to save recorded sound, right? Where he feels that the digitization of music has had a bunch of negative side effects, and he wants to try to reclaim an emphasis on real sound. And it's interesting. He locates realness in high fidelity. So he feels, so it's not that he feels that digital sound in itself is the problem, or that it's somehow more artificial. It's that it's not high enough resolution. And so, we've accepted this compromise in the form of the MP3, and that now we're sort of stuck with this format, and it needs to be improved now that we have the bandwidth, and that's what he's trying to do through his Neil Young Archives site. Um, and so this kind of high definition audio, and I think, as I mentioned in the course, the problem is that people don't actually care, and that in double blind tests, people can't tell the difference. And so for him, it begins to approach this kind of magical realm, right? I don't know if Neil has ever sat down to a double blind test between a 192 kilohertz MP3 and his, high definition sound from his website, whether he can tell the difference in an A/B double blind test. But that's the problem. And then he starts saying, well, it's just something you feel, right? So when he was launching his Pono service, he enlisted all of these rock stars who were, of course, testifying, because everybody loves Neil Young, and they were testifying how they, suddenly I felt the joy again that I used to have from listening to music. And so there also begins to be a little bit of he's trying to get that magic vibe. And so it's not something that can necessarily be quantified. But we really see that with, especially with On the Beach, where he is looking for that not perfect, going back to the, just the studio situations and all of that, where he's trying to find that. He's not looking for that perfect take, right? He wants it to have the mistakes left in. He wants it to have that raw, real quality. And that's really where that takes off. And he's kind of run with that ever since.
Mm-hmm. And on that theme of realness, Mike, I just want to give a little plug to the documentary we have streaming right now on our Hot Docs at Home platform, Neil Young Journeys, for which you contributed a lovely little pre-film intro for us. And to all of you folks at home, if you haven't checked it out yet, I do want to encourage you to check it out. That's Neil Young Journeys. It's a great documentary by the filmmaker Jonathan Demme, profiling Neil in 2011 as he prepares for a concert at Massey Hall. And on that theme of realness, there's a lovely little moment where Neil is driving in his car saying, I always listen to my new recordings in my car, that
Mm-hmm.
I want to be able to hear what the music sounds like in a real world setting, to know that I'm doing it right, that I've absorbed what I need to absorb. But just to build on that, Mike, this idea of realness and rawness in sort of from a slightly different perspective, we got a lot of questions from folks wanting to get your thoughts on sort of the relationship between what was happening in Neil's personal life in the mid-'70s while he was in this incredibly fertile period. Our audience member, Carl Devlin, wrote in to write, what do you make of the fact, Mike, that the period in the early to mid-'70s where Neil recorded some of his most iconic albums was also one of the most tumultuous periods in his personal life, what with the death of his former bandmate Danny Whitten and the end of his relationship with Carrie Snodgrass? Was he someone who could channel personal strife into his art without letting his demons totally overwhelm him and kill his productivity?
Yeah, I think that he thrives on emotional turmoil. It's probably not very much fun being there, but it's good for art. And I think he's not alone in finding that at the times of that incredible Ditch trilogy that came out of grief, not just of the death of Danny Whitten, but of his roadie and friend Bruce Berry. It took him to that raw place. There was also a huge amount of drugs involved, and so I think the role of drugs in Neil's music can't be ignored. But there's also something in his makeup where he is a survivor, where he's never going to go all the way with it. He's not going to go too far with it, but he definitely, at times in his career, earlier times, I don't think he's there anymore, but in earlier times, he deliberately put himself into a sort of an altered state for long periods of time. And I think part of that was to try to break down the emotional walls and try to reach something that was authentic. I think when we look at Neil's songs, he constantly talks about in his process of trying to just let things come out and not to process them too much, you know, not to edit himself too much, and not to worry too much about whether it is coherent, or not worry about contradicting himself. You know, I think he realizes that when he's able to get into that unconscious kind of state, that great things come out. And the more you think about things, well, what do they say? When you think, you stink when it comes to music. So I think I think that's part of it. I think that that time in his life also coincided with his heaviest drug taking and drinking.
So, Mike, a number of interesting questions from audience members who have attended your past series at Curious Minds and have had the chance to compare, the life and career trajectory of Neil to other iconic songwriters like Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell, Bob Dylan. And folks were really interested to hear you compare Neil's process of aging and maturation to these other icons, both in terms of musical productivity, but also in terms of their personal changes as individuals, as they've, entered the final decades of their lives. One audience member, Janet, wrote in to say how much she liked the line in your last lecture where you said, Neil hasn't been taking a victory lap. So compare Neil's kind of career trajectory as he's entered his golden years to some of these other musical icons, both musically and in terms of the personal growth you see.
Yeah. Well, I think that, so if we look at Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell, and Neil Young, and so, you have all of these artists who were doing great work in the 1960s and 1970s, and I think that every one of them faced a kind of stylistic crisis in the 80s. There really seemed to be, there was something about the 1980s that made artists feel like they had to change what they were doing to keep up, or they had to modernize in some way to sort of buy into that. So all four of these artists changed the sound, allowed the sounds of their recordings to take on some of the trappings of the 1980s, like drum machines, synthesizers, all of them. And then coming out of that, you really see a divergence. And so in the case of Bob Dylan, you see Bob in the 90s really going back to into sort of constant touring, and that becoming sort of the central object of his career. That is that the records are kind of an incidental to what Bob Dylan does, that it's really the tours year after year, or what his fans call the never-ending tours. And on those tours, that's his playground. And so he'll do some of his old songs, but he will render them unrecognizable. And so you constantly hear the stories of people going to a Bob Dylan concert, and I couldn't even tell it was blowing in the wind, and he wouldn't do like a Rolling Stone and people walking out and all that sort of thing. So Bob has had this almost a very sort of contrary approach to dealing with his legacy, because the thing that happens right in the 90s for all of these is, am I an oldies act, right? And so in the 90s, Leonard Cohen, he really drops out for years, becomes a Buddhist monk. And when he comes out again, he's not touring, he's doing these odd little albums. And so he's not engaging with his past really at all. And finally, he does that in his final tours, the tours that he undertakes really because he's had his savings embezzled by his manager. And so he has to go out there. He does the old songs. People love it. It's a victory lap, absolutely. and nobody's complaining. He makes a ton of money. And then you have Joni, and Joni, I think of all of them, Joni wanted the most to continue to be a current artist into the 80s and 90s. And so she resisted, being an oldies act and relying on her best loved material. And so I think it embittered her for a while. And then in the 2000s, she actually revisits a lot of that old material, but in an orchestral setting, the Both Sides Now project of 2000, for example. And so in the end, she is celebrating her legacy. And then, of course, in recent years, she's been sort of out of commission. Neil, I think, he's had a great balance, I think, in terms of doing regular touring, but not constant touring, continuing to put out new music where he's not trying to, sometimes he is hearkening back to his older sound and sometimes not. And so he has had a balance between, newer albums that really sound like older albums, like Crazy Horse albums or country albums, or acoustic albums, and then others that have been complete departures, like the big band album with Storytone, for example, or the album that he did in the record booth at Third Man Records in Nashville. So, and then in his concerts, there's always a balance between old material delivered in kind of the same way that it was before, so that gives it that satisfying quality. You see that in the Massey Hall film, in the Journeys film, where, when he does his old songs, he does them in a way that's satisfying to the fans, and he doesn't do it in that sort of perverse Bob Dylan way where he changes the key and the time signature and the melody and the chords and the words, So I think he's really struck that balance, while at the same time, nobody thinks of Neil Young as an oldies act. We think of him, I think more than any of those artists, people today think of Neil as a still vital artist, which is an extremely hard trick to pull off, all these decades later. So I think he's done it really well, and he's probably had the best time of it. Also, I think he did the best in terms of popularity in the 90s over all of those artists, with his kind of huge second act as being the godfather of grunge and, Rockin' in the Free World and all of that stuff. He really kept it going, much longer than a lot of those other artists who were really sort of fans only artists by that point.
Right. He stayed a very relevant cultural figure.
Pretty much.
As all the real excitement about Homegrown can attest to, just the sheer amount of coverage we've been seeing in the last month or two. So, Mike, we've got time for just a few more questions here. So I want to hit on one theme that a number of people wrote in on, which is Neil's relationship to Canada. That's something certainly at the heart of the documentary Journeys that we've been referencing, but also something that runs throughout his biography, various biographies that have been written of him, and his autobiography. Tom Saunders in the audience wrote in to ask, in Neil's biography, Shaky, he wrote that he was proud to be a Canadian, but I don't let it hold me back. What do you think he meant by this, Mike? And how would you compare Neil's relationship to his home country to some of those other famous Canadian singer-songwriters that you just mentioned, and indeed to other pop cultural icons we've seen in recent decades who made the migration to the U.S. to make it big?
You had to. In Neil's generation, it was impossible to make any sort of significant recording career in Canada. We just didn't have the infrastructure for it. Our record companies were largely issuing product from the US, and then after the British invasion from Britain, it was until the CanCon regulation was put through in 1971, the mandate of a certain percentage of Canadian content had to be broadcast on radio and television. it was pretty impossible for a Canadian artist to do much at all without going to New York in those days, or in the late 60s, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Los Angeles. And so Neil was like many, David Clayton Thomas, went to New York, joined Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Boom, he's huge. He was always a giant talent, but we just couldn't. Our industry wasn't big enough, and our population wasn't big enough to make a star of David here in Canada. You look at the Sparrow, which would morph into Steppenwolf. They had to go to New York and then to LA to really get anywhere. And as soon as they did, boom, they're huge, So, and it was the same thing with Neil. He kind of couldn't get arrested in Yorkville. He was here. He was trying to play in the folk clubs. As far as I can tell, he never got a gig, as at least one that was listed in any of the 3 Toronto daily papers. He would do the Monday night hootenannies at the Riverboat, and then he joined the Minor Birds. But they played a little bit around here. They were already an established band. They signed to Motown. He goes down and does those recordings, and then that thing implodes because Rick James has to go into prison for being a Navy deserter. And so he and Bruce Palmer from the Minor Birds get back to Toronto, and they're like, let's blow this pop stand. And they head to Los Angeles, and boom, Buffalo Springfield is formed, and people see Neil Young and they lose their minds, because he's this incredible talent. And so, you had to go to the U.S. to do anything at that time. A few years later, maybe not. You could stay in Canada, but Neil knows that the industry was in the U.S. and he likes the U.S. and so he stuck around. But he loves Canada. He keeps coming back here. You can't really get it out of you. Same with Joni. You can't really get it out of your system. And so there's a great love, but I think it's a nostalgic love for Neil that his home is in the U.S. and has been for a very long time.
Right. So in terms of not letting it hold him back, it's just that need for professional opportunity
it's just
brought him
just business.
Yeah. We're wrapping up here, Mike, but there is, just to build on this idea of Neil Young's place within Canadian pop cultural history. A lot of Curious Minds audience members have written in with fun personal anecdotes, their Neil Young sightings over the years, family lore involving the Young family, great articles they read in Maclean's in the early 70s or even in the 60s, right? The writing of Neil's father, the great sports writer, Scott Young. I want to share one personal anecdote that I think is pretty fun from our Curious Minds regular, Judy Anglin, before I ask you if you've got any good Neil Young stories. But Judy wrote in to say that she grew up in the Bayview and Moore area of Toronto, and her parents met Scott Young at a party in the 60s. At the time, he was working at the Toronto Telegram newspaper. Later, Judy's mother was shopping at the local Loblaw store and ran into Scott. When she asked after his children, Scott shook his head and said, "I'm very worried about Neil. He's quit school and seems to have become a hippie." I don't know what's going to become of him. And Judy says her mother used to love to tell this story more and more as the years passed and Neil became more and more famous. P.S. She loved the series and wanted to extend her thanks. But I like this story from Judy, Mike, because I think it speaks to the way that Neil has kind of entered the civic folklore of Canada, and especially here in the Greater Toronto area and Ontario. So I wonder, do you have any favorite Neil Young stories that you've heard from local friends and musical collaborators who have had direct encounters with Neil or his family over the years?
Well, it's funny. I heard a very similar story to that. I interviewed Joe Lewis, who was a columnist for the Telegram and a radio host in that time, and he talks about working with Scott Young at the Telegram, And Scott saying basically the same type of thing, that he was worried about Neil, and that, I don't think this is going to work. He was quite worried about, and that's pretty well documented, that Neil's mother Rassie was the real booster, and Scott to California on that trip. And so that these some of the people that I've spoken to in my Yorkville research who had encounters with Neil, remember him as a pretty intense individual, somebody who was really serious about music. I mean, nothing really surprising or out of character. But the thing about him though was that he was, like I say, like he was really not visible on the scene when he was here very much. I interviewed the drummer from the Minor Birds, Rickman Mason, and he tells a story about when Rick James was, quite into the drugs, and he had introduced Neil to poppers, amyl nitrates. They were these pills. I think they're these capsules that you would pop and you would inhale them. And Neil, one night playing with the Minor Birds, Neil had gotten so excited that he was doing a guitar solo, and he was like sort of jumping around the stage, and the cord popped out of his guitar, and he just kept playing. He didn't realize that he had become unplugged. Yeah.
Right.
Things were a little crazy in those days.
For a guy who liked to keep it real, he also liked to keep it surreal at times as well, it seems like. So, Mike, we're running out of time here, so I'm going to quickly combine two questions into sort of a final question before we wrap up. A question from Paul Collins, who asked, Mike, what are your desert island records for Neil? Like, if you can only listen to one album from him for the rest of time, what's it going to be? And then a sort of related question, just relating to his bigger legacy, that came in from a couple of folks. Was Neil Young a genius? That term gets thrown around a lot, but when you consider his influence, his ability to create and execute an original style, does it apply to Neil? So your desert island record, and then the big, bold question, was Neil Young a genius?
I guess my desert island record would be After the Gold Rush, because for me, that one has all the bits of Neil all together in one album. The electric Neil, the acoustic Neil, a little bit of country Neil, rock Neil, soft, sensitive Neil, angry Neil. It's all in there. And so, beautifully, great songs, beautifully executed. So for me, though I have to say my sentimental favorite, and so this would be, for a whole different reason, would be On the Beach, because On the Beach, to me, there's something really, I have a personal connection with that album, more than any of the others. And I can't really explain it the way that I can. I think, so After the Gold Rush is the logical choice, and On the Beach is the sentimental choice for me. Mm-hmm. And if I had to take one song, it would be Ambulance Blues. That song to me is that's the peak to me. That's mm-hmm. peak Neil to me. Mm-hmm. And when I was putting together the series, listening to that song again, I was just reminded of what a spell he casts with that song. Was Neil Young a genius? I don't even know that I believe in that as any sort of objective or stable category. I think that Neil Young, we have to realize that Neil Young was also lucky. I'm not saying that he didn't have, a great work ethic, natural ability, an outlook that is appealing, but he also he was in the right place at the right time for a lot of things, and so he was fortunate, like all of those artists that we talked about, um, Bob and Joni and Leonard as well, to have come into the music business at a time when record companies developed artists, where record companies allowed artists to make albums that didn't sell and didn't drop them from their contracts, where you could experiment in public and not have a bunch of music business people breathing down your neck telling you how to do your art. The late 60s and the early 70s was a great time for that, where the record companies were making so much money and they didn't purport to understand why one thing sold and another thing didn't. So they largely left the artists alone, gave them huge budgets, and let them do their thing. And that was a unique moment in time. And so Neil benefited from that. There's no other way to say it. So it's a perfect storm of Neil's qualities and his the way that he's approached his career and his work and his personality and all of that, but also context, historical context, that he was there at a good time for he was at the right time for an artist such as he was.
Mm-hmm.
That's how.
Well, Mike, it has been, as always, a delight digging into that historical context with you over the course of this series and in this Q&A. It's all the time we've got for now, but I want to just close by thanking you again for yet another wonderful series here at Curious Minds. To our audience members at home, remember, this series is available for streaming until early October, so if you haven't wrapped up yet, you've got plenty of time to do so, and plenty of time to let all the other Neil Young lovers in your life know about this series and enjoy this. Mike and I will continue to send you some follow-up emails in the next couple of weeks with a couple more little tidbits that we think you might enjoy, and as well as the recording of this live conversation. But rest assured, you have not seen the last of Mike Daley around these here parts. We'll have more collaborations coming your way here at Curious Minds very soon. In the meantime, Mike, give us a little update on some of the upcoming projects you'll be cracking away on in the coming months. You mentioned your Yorkville book. I imagine that's you're making some headway there. What'll you be up to in the next few months?
Well, yeah, I'm still researching, still interviewing, and writing up my Yorkville book. I've made some good strides in the last couple of weeks, especially as far as beginning to feel like things are starting to come together, and that I've got a huge amount of material that I'm research and interviews and that I'm processing, and so I'm excited about this Yorkville book. A lot of things that have never come to light before, and I hope a unique perspective on this incredible time in music history. At the same time, I'm also researching a second book on the Toronto sound, and so looking especially at the rhythm and blues bands and the rock and roll scene around Yonge Street and around the suburban dances in the 1960s. And so that's, as soon as this Yorkville thing is put away, I'm going to head right into that. So that's what's going on. I'm just knee deep in Yorkville right now, and so right now doing the Mina Bird, the El Patio, the Flick, Chez Monique, some of the sort of mid to late 60s places. And of course, Neil Young is part of that history, as well as, many, many other acts. And so it's exciting. So
Absolutely.
That's what's happening.
Absolutely.
And also, any updates, of course, I would point to my website, MikeDaleyMusic.com. You can always sign up with me there and get my newsletter. And, if you're interested in hearing about the Yorkville project as it's going on and other things, they can be found there.
Absolutely. A great resource for music lovers far and wide, MikeDaleyMusic.com. calm. And of course, folks, remember as well, check out Neil Young Journeys on the Hot Docs at Home platform to see Mike do a little intro before that fun documentary. I'm afraid that's all the time we've got for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and another heartfelt thanks to you, Mike. It's always a pleasure. Keep on rocking in the free world. We'll see you again very soon.
Okay.
All right. Cheers.